Head back to this breaking story that we have been covering over the last several hours here. A top Iranian commander believed to be among the dead after an apparent Israeli airstrike next to Iran's embassy in Syria that also killed at least 5 other people. Footage showed the strike in the Damascus area of Meza hit a building adjacent to the Iranian embassy. Now, Iranian media reporting the targeted building was Iran's consulate and ambassador's home. Fox News reporting the strike is believed to have killed Mohammad Reza Zaheda, senior commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Do want to talk a lot more about this and break down the latest out of the Middle East. So let's bring in Behnam Ben Taleblu, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, first off, can you tell me what we know about this airstrike so far? I know all of this is developing, so information is kind of slowly coming in, but what exactly do we know for sure?
Well, this does remind me, and it's a pleasure to be with you, this does remind me of a similar Israeli strike, one in Lebanon that went after a Palestinian individual, Salah al-Aruri, who was really the connective tissue between Iran and Hamas, particularly after 2017. And what we see from the imagery after this airstrike reminds me a great deal of the imagery after that airstrike. Pinprick, targeted, specific, going after a facility housing an individual that is tied to basically the broader Iran threat network. In that case, one member of Iran's proxy network. In this element, one element of Iran's command and control network. These are literal Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps designated terrorist uniform officers. Syria is essentially the land bridge, the connective tissue between Iran, afterwards, obviously, Iraq, and then Syria itself with the Assad regime, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is the most potent of all of Iran's terror proxies. Indeed, unfortunately, it does make sense that these military individuals with a terrorist background were housed or somewhere near the Iranian embassy. As we know, many of these Iranian embassies function as dual use zones for training and future terror operations. And in essence here, this is someone with a history of service both in Syria and in Lebanon. Zahedi was a brigadier general who was the Quds Force, that's the elite extraterritorial foreign operations unit of the IRGC, who was basically the chief commander for the Syria-Lebanon division. He has a history of service in the Iran-Iraq war. He cut his teeth on all of the issues that the IRGC cut their teeth in. And, you know, he's held leadership positions in the ground forces, briefly in the air force of the IRGC, and then even guarding the greater Tehran IRGC base as commander there. So he's certainly a high up individual. And all questions now are going to be posed to how is Iran going to respond? You know, the regime likes to wash away blood with blood and has been increasingly bold about more openly responding to threats against it with missile and drone operations, as we've seen in the Middle East.
So I guess the question becomes, do you think that there will be any sort of retaliation? I mean, as you've said, it's kind of blood for blood is Iran's MO, I guess. So my question, is something going to happen? Is something likely to happen?
Unfortunately, the way the Iranians, I would say, are looking at the social landscape across the Middle East, their perception of the Arab governments of the region, their perception of American resolve and staying power, they believe they have time on their side. And when they believe they have time on their side, that means they can afford to do several things. Now, there's at least 3 domains I would keep my eye on. One is basically the air domain. So basically, you know, the Iranians could fire missiles or drones via proxy at Israel, directly at something that they believe is owned or controlled by Israel. At least 2 times the Iranians have fired at targets in Iraq, ultimately civilian targets, ultimately Kurdish business targets in Iraq that they allege were Mossad facilities in that country, once in 2022 and once in 2024. The regime could kind of manufacture something like that again to have a show of strength, or it can engage in something a bit more direct, but covert, like cyber, or it can engage in something else in between, you know, kind of a graduated stepping up of the Iran-backed terrorism that we already do see in the region.
Could this cause the entire war between Israel and Hamas and, I mean, the impending war, so to speak, between Israel and Hezbollah, could that cause it all to escalate from here?
Again, it depends a great deal on how much Iran wants to respond or how long their time frame for an actual military response is. I certainly think there is one coming, but again, the manner, the location, those are all really up for debate. And Iran may think that it's responding adequately because it has essentially managed to encircle Israel on several fronts, managed to actually kill Americans indirectly through proxies in Iraq and Syria, striking at American targets in Iraq, Syria, and most recently Jordan, and still not have to pay a price. Its proxies on the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, the Houthis in Yemen, are literally impeding traffic using Iranian weapons, impeding legitimate civilian maritime traffic using weapons, and still no direct pushback against the Iranians. So the Iranians may also calculate that they can afford to do more of the same without having to escalate and call that an adequate response as well, because again, they're still believing in their mind that they're getting off scot-free.
We've talked a lot about Hamas and Hezbollah over the past several months since October 7th, but can you explain who overall the Iranian Revolutionary Guard really is and kind of the role that they play in all of this?
That's really kind of the spinal cord of this broader terrorist apparatus. And it was actually formed very early in the heyday of the revolution. There were several versions of this Guard Corps that during this kind of foundational conflict, the bloody 8-year Iran-Iraq war, they all kind of coalesced into one larger Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But in essence, this was a paramilitary initially formed out of armed committees enforcing revolutionary justice in the heyday of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the need to continue to arm zealous believers was basically the regime's way of fomenting a counterpoint or a counterweight to the conventional military or the national military that formerly was Western trained in Iran under the then US aligned Shah. And then over time, this military body began to develop tentacles and touch points overseas. They were charged with literally spreading the revolution, not just throughout the region, but throughout the world. Lest we forget, the I in IRGC does not stand for Iranian, it stands for Islamic. It has an inherently transnational mission. It has helped create or co-opt, but ultimately control much of the terror threat that we face from Iran today, whether that's the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the panoply of Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. It is supporting the grotesque butcherous regime of the Assad family in Syria, supporting materially Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, trying to make inroads into the West Bank, and then perhaps most importantly for the global economy, supporting since at least 2015 militarily the Houthis in Yemen when they.
Tell me about the relationship between Israel and Iran, where it stands now versus where it stood, let's say, before October 7th.
Well, the Iranian government, in particular, the political elites, the military elite, security elite, have not broadcasting their attentions towards Israel. This is a regime that chants death to Israel, and they quite literally mean it. They've been putting their money where their mouth is towards this threat. You've had really the state and society diverge for decades now, with the Iranian people chanting, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran, whereas you still have the regime in Iran taking the oil money, taking the national wealth of Iran, and spending it on the altar of these ideational kind of terrorist, third world revisionist projects, not just in Iran, but throughout the Middle East, like this kind of instrumental and material support for terror. So pre-October 7, post-October 7, the Islamic Republic remains perhaps the most important anti-status quo, anti-American, anti-Israeli actor in the region. And because it is a state, it simply has more resources to put towards that than this kind of broader panoply of non-state actors that we see in the region. And the more there are kind of a constellation of failed states in the region, like Iraq, like Syria, like Lebanon, like Yemen, the easier it is for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to use those countries and dispossessed and downtrodden people in those countries to kind of function as agents of influence of part of Iran's war against Israel, as well as part of Iran's war against America.
We're coming up here on the 6-month mark since that October 7th attack. When this all first started, when the war first broke out, did you think this is where we would be 6 months later?
Sadly, I'm no prophet. I just kind of look at the trend lines. Sadly, yes, I think the Iranians believe that they have an advantage here. And the advantage they believe they have, and again, this is the kind of channeling the mentality and the statements of the regime, political, military, and religious elites. They believe that America is a paper tiger that's leaving the region. They believe that you can successfully fight Israel through a death by a thousand cuts strategy, through a larger boom and bust cycle of violence. That's what you've seen 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, in these different iterations of Israeli wars with Gaza, with whether it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas in Gaza. And, right now, I think the regime feels comfortable. It's worried about the fate of the lowest of low-hanging fruit in this larger constellation of terror proxies that it calls the axis of resistance. It's worried about the fate of Hamas, but it's doing everything it can to not get as directly involved to save Hamas. And my great fear here is that if this is how well they've been able to play the game to save a proxy that is on a low scale of importance for them, like Hamas, imagine what might happen if they try to bail out their most successful proxy, which is Hezbollah in Lebanon.
All right. Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Fellow at Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to be here with us. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
No, I think that should be it. Just kind of keep your eyes on if Iran decides to go public with a military response. This is a regime that has an immense drone arsenal and the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. And unfortunately, there is a lowering bar, a lowering threshold for the use of these weapons. So expect more, not less, of these kind of attacks in the future.
All right. Thank you again for being here with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.